Hello, welcome to the Comic Book Commentary. I'm Bo Leidig, and this week we're going to be once again talking about the other Spawn miniseries that was happening in the summer of 1995 with Spawn Blood Feud number 2. So let's zoom in and take a closer look. First published in July of 1995, this book unfortunately suffers from the same problem that plagued Violator vs. Badrock number 3. And that is that because of it not being released in the right schedule to coincide with the ongoing series, it doesn't make sense the order that these things are happening in. So the events of the Spawn Blood Feud miniseries were supposed to lead into issue number 33 of Spawn. However, because issue number 33 of Spawn came out in the exact same month as issue number 2 of Blood Feud, July of 95, it totally throws a wrench in the whole thing because there are story points that were already supposed to have been explained in this miniseries that are having direct effects on the Spawn ongoing monthly series. And because we didn't get this story completed and out before that, we're seeing the results of the story points that happen in this miniseries in the ongoing series with no context or explanation as to what caused them. And the whole thing is just kind of a confusing mess, I suppose. Although I will say, at least this book has a pretty nice cover. I can't complain about that. I do like what was done here, and I think it's actually pretty cool overall. Story, Alan Moore. Art, Tony Daniel, Kevin Conrad. Letters, Tom Orzechowski. Color, Todd Broker. Additional thanks to Electric Pickle and Philip Timper. Okay, Electric Pickle, thanks for your help. We see here on the first page that the story picks up where it left off in the first issue, where we see Spawn making his escape after being surrounded by a numerous amount of police officers who believe that he is responsible for the murders that took place in the apartment building that he was found outside of. Now, to the credit of the police officers, Spawn was covered in blood with victims strewn all around him, so it does seem like he's the most likely culprit. Although I do find it funny that when he's making his escape here, the entirety of all the surrounding officers just open fire with reckless abandon to whatever bystanders or innocents might be around. Like, they're just blasting away with most of their bullets missing Spawn. It makes for a cool action shot, but keep in mind, there's just stray bullets flying all over this part of the city and potentially going into people's windows or hitting anyone that may be in the surrounding area as they ricochet off of Spawn's chains. It's definitely not, the way you would want the PD to respond to something like this, putting the general public at large in the crosshairs of, this threat that they're trying to stop. As we turn the page, we realize that the image we saw on the first page, along with the images shown in the first few panels of the second, are actually part of a news broadcast, and that the news has asked one Mr. John Sansker, the head of the NYPD Extra Normal Task Force, to step in and answer a few questions. They ask Sansker what's going on. Is there any real definition as to what they're up against here? And Sansker says that he does believe that this Spawn character poses an extra normal hazard to the citizens of New York. The host asks if he means that Spawn is in fact a vampire. Sansker responds by stating that he doesn't like to throw the V word around all haphazardly, but he is not ruling out that possibility. The host asks then if in fact Spawn does count as supernatural, but Sansker corrects him, stating, "I don't like to use the term supernatural, I like the word extra normal, because I don't believe there's anything that can't be explained by natural means." But the host pressed, saying, well, if in fact this is some sort of extra normal threat that we don't really understand, is killing the threat necessarily the best course of action? Sansker replies by stating that no, in an ideal world it's not. However, because this threat is costing the lives of innocents, that it must be stopped at all costs. And if that means hunting the Spawn down and killing it, then that is what must be done. Watching all of this unfold on the TVs inside of an electronics store is none other than Spawn himself, as he realizes that things are going pretty bad and that he's in real trouble, as there's basically an APB across the entirety of New York City, and everyone with any information about him is going to basically turn him over to the cops. Spawn then realizes that the list of people that he can trust is very short, and that he is in a really bad predicament and needs a way to protect himself. However, all of the military hardware that he stole and used to defeat Overt Kill in their first meeting has vanished from the place that he hid it, but he knows exactly where it ended up, and that is in the hands of one Jacob Groenfeld, who is an urban arms dealer of sorts and is someone that Spawn worked with in his past life as Al Simmons. So he decides to contact Jacob, looking him up in the phone book and calling him, and he then moves across the rooftops of New York City to Jacob's apartment. Jacob allows him entry and talks with Spawn a little bit, kind of, trying to put him at ease, and even takes the time to make him some coffee as the two of them catch up on old times. And this is kind of a go for broke situation, as, Spawn has taken a lot of precautions to not really let anyone know that he is in fact the reincarnated version of Al Simmons. And for him to go out and state, like, oh, by the way, this is me, Al Simmons, I just look different than the last time you saw me, is him taking a real big risk, and it kind of shows the gravity of the situation that he's currently found himself involved in. Back in the newsroom, after the interview with Sansker has wrapped up, he's making his way to the door when he's intercepted by Sam and Twitch. Sam tells him that they've received a tip from an informant who goes by the name of Sonny, and states that he was told that Sansker would know exactly where to find him. Sansker thanks Sam for the info as they make their way up to the rooftop so that he can enter his helicopter, and at this point Sam takes the time to ask a few questions, like, if Spawn is a vampire, then how come the victims aren't drained of blood? And Sansker says, perhaps he didn't have time to do so. Sam then asks, well, there was also a blood bank that was robbed earlier tonight, and gallons of blood were stolen from there. Do you think there's any connection? Sansker says that he really couldn't say without any kind of, evidence or investigation to go on. At this point, Sam says, well, that's true. I'm sorry to hold you up. Incidentally, Twitch, you were right about the tan. At this point, Sansker questions what exactly they're talking about, but Twitch responds stating it's just cop humor, like on NYPD Blue. As the helicopter starts to lift off, Sam states, be careful, I hope you can find your way okay in the dark. And Sansker says not to worry, he's had plenty of practice in that area. He then tells the pilot that there's an apartment building nearby that he needs to get as close to as possible, and that there's someone there he needs to talk to as we see the skyline. And we realize now that Sam is starting to ask some questions that Sansker doesn't have really good answers for, and that Sam and Twitch are starting to question exactly what Sansker's motives are in all of this, and if he can be trusted. Back at Jacob's apartment, Spawn thanks his friend Jacob for allowing him in and listening to him. He even begins to start to unload on some of his problems. Jacob responds by saying, it's no problem, Al. Your hardware was sold to me last month by a couple of punks. I got it stashed in a safe place. Spawn responds by saying, I'm really glad to hear that you still trust me. After the past few days, I'm not even sure I trust myself anymore. Jacob starts to question this, stating, Al, you were always a real great guy when I was around you back in Costa Rica and the Philippines. But Spawn responds by stating, that guy's long gone. He's dead now, and the only thing left is what you see before you. And things like that have changed a bunch, including with this costume that I'm wearing. It's a part of me, it's alive, and I can't always control it. And sometimes I'm afraid that it's going to hurt people, including my friends. Imagine how that would make you feel, not being able to stop yourself from hurting people that you care about. At that point, Jacob responds by stating, yeah, I guess that would make me feel pretty bad and kind of guilty. We also see that he's starting to tremble a little bit as we see a sound starting to come up from the distance at the bottom of the panel. Spawn then responds by stating, yeah, it's actually worse than feeling guilty. He's like, I never thought I'd say this, but I actually miss my old life in the company days. Things seemed so much simpler when I was just following orders. And he even misses the dumb jokes that all of the guys used to have with each other. For instance, Spawn states, I was the only black guy in the unit, so everyone called me Snowman. You were the oldest guy. And Jacob responds by stating, yeah, and they all called me Sonny. And we now know that Jacob is in fact the informant who contacted Sansker. Jacob, aka Sonny, then responds by stating, you know, Al, I remember those days and they were great, and I want you to know that I'm going to help you out with this Canadian guy, this Sansker. However, this suddenly triggers Spawn to react, stating, wait a minute, I never told you he was Canadian. What's this all about? And at this point, Sonny knows that the jig is up, and he says, look, Al, you know how this business is. Sometimes you got to do things you don't want to do to keep yourself alive, and this is one of those times, and I'm really sorry. Please don't hurt me, as the sound of the helicopter that Sansker in is getting louder and louder as we see the lights of the helicopter shining into Sonny's window. At this point, Sansker leaps from the helicopter and bursts through the window of Sonny's apartment, catching Spawn completely off guard. Spawn even thinking to himself, what in the world is this guy with this Hugo Boss suit and this ugly orange tan? None of this makes sense. At this point, Sansker says, good evening, little monster, I am death, as he lunges towards Spawn. However, Spawn even notes that Sansker's speed is almost incomprehensible and that he can't react fast enough to defend himself. Sansker lunges and grabs a hold of Spawn, stating, oh, this is, something you probably haven't dealt with before, someone who's much stronger and faster than you, and this is the novelty of fear that you have forgotten. He then lifts Spawn up in the air as he attempts to continue his assault, and Spawn is shocked, stating that he's being thrown around like a rag doll and that he can't believe how strong this guy is. As he wonders what his next move is, Sansker then throws Spawn out through another window of the apartment, out over the street, as we see Sonny screaming, oh my god, from inside of the apartment. As Spawn tumbles through the air, his costume reacts by trying to grab onto the helicopter with the chains, and Spawn tries to figure out exactly how all this is happening. He can't imagine how on earth Sansker was able to track down Sonny, let alone get some kind of influence over him. As he falls helplessly, he decides to try and slow things down with his chains and land on a nearby rooftop. He then realizes that he has to try and make his escape, as his costume doesn't seem to be responding the way that it normally does, and that he's afraid Sansker may be too much for him. However, as he starts to get to his feet, Sansker is already right behind him, as Spawn can't believe that he was able to get to him this quickly. Sansker then smashes Spawn's head down into the concrete of the rooftop and states, I haven't finished with you yet. Sansker then grabs Spawn by his cape and starts to lift him up, as he states that he's actually rather disappointed that he's been studying Spawn for a long time and he wonders where all those fancy special effects are at. He then grabs Spawn by the neck and begins to choke him, stating, I never even found out exactly where you came from, some sort of demon realm or one of the dark dimensions, but then stating it doesn't really matter because whatever hell he came from, he's going back to. However, at this point, Spawn's cape decides to take matters into its own hands and grabs Sansker by the head and hurl him across the rooftop like a child. Spawn is actually surprised when this happens, as he was not the one consciously doing it. The costume just reacted on its own. However, despite its best efforts, Sansker is merely stunned, and Spawn realizes that between Sansker and the several police helicopters that are approaching, that he's drastically outnumbered, and his best course of action right now is a steady retreat. As the police helicopters approach, they ask Sansker if he's alright, and he states that he's okay. They ask if they should pursue Spawn and try to track him down. However, Sansker tells them not to worry about it, as dawn is approaching quickly, and that he has to keep the same hours as his prey, therefore he's rather tired. He then states that the creature can enjoy its last night of freedom and its last break of dawn, because this is the last one it will ever see, as it won't be around to see the next one. Later on that day, down by the docks, Spawn is approached by a homeless person that we've never seen before, and we don't get the name of in this issue. who states, Al, what are you doing? Al says, what does it look like I'm doing? I'm trying to get this damned costume off of me. And he then states that it's ripping most of his flesh off as he does. And he then instructs the homeless man to get the dock hooks that are nearby to aid him in removing the costume. The man hooks the cape with one of the hooks and then states, Al, I don't like this. It's making noises inside of my head. Spawn responds by stating that's how this thing screams. And he then tells him to keep helping him get it off of him, that he's tired of this thing. It makes him do things that he doesn't want to do, like hurt innocent people, and that it also gives him terrible dreams and he just wants it gone. As they finally get the last of the costume off, the man states that, wow, you got it off and it seems like it tore the hell out of you. Spawn states, I wish it had because I'm done with hell, but these wounds will heal if I want them to. He then instructs the man that he has to go get this trunk, as there's only one way to make sure that the costume can't reattach itself to Spawn, which is exactly what he wants. The two men work together to force Spawn's costume into the trunk, and Spawn slams the lid closed. The homeless man states, Al, I don't know if I'd be getting rid of this stuff. Some people would die for threads like that. And Spawn throws the trunk into the water and states, many have. He then realizes that he doesn't feel so good all of a sudden, and that he's actually quite cold and that he needs some clothes. The homeless man states that he's got an extra set of rags he can loan him, as he gives them to Spawn. Spawn puts them on and states, I've seen worse, not that I can recall where, but I probably have at some point. He then asks if the trunk has gone under, and the man responds by stating, yeah, you deep-sixed it. Spawn, then wearing a trench coat and some ragged clothing, says, good, I'm ready to be rid of that thing. And that, I need to get back to the alleyways to get some rest, as apparently separating himself from the costume has exhausted him. He then states that if the police and the press and old friends have all turned traitor, at least he still commands the respect of winos and deadbeats. Lucky me. And he then states, come on, let's get back to the alleys. As they approach, they're spotted by the three homeless men that we saw in issue number 1, who have started to have some second thoughts about whether or not Spawn is a good thing for them in their lives, as they seem to be looking over one of the warning flyers that the police were handing out in the previous issue. They state, here comes Al, everybody act normal, as it seems like they may be formulating a plan to possibly betray their former quote-unquote leader. One of the men states, hey Al, did you have a good night? And Spawn responds by stating, are you serious? I'm blamed for a massacre, I'm jumped by some kind of Mountie, and I'm dressed worse than you are. No, I didn't have a good night, okay? They then apologize for asking, and then Spawn says, yeah, well, listen, since I got rid of my outfit, I'm feeling really run down, so I gotta grab some shut-eye on my throne. Which reminds me, I need some cushions for that thing, so how about you get some, okay? They say, yeah, sure, we'll take care of it, leave it to us. And then Al straight says, see that you do, now I'm going to sleep and I don't want to be disturbed. And they're like, yeah, sure, sweet dreams. And at this point, you realize as Spawn falls asleep that he is kind of treating these guys like straight up crap. And it's understandable that perhaps they're not exactly thrilled about him, just bossing them around and treating them like servants instead of friends. And as Spawn drifts off to sleep, his mind starts to wander into another dream state, like we've seen in the previous issue. In his dream state, Spawn sees the trunk that he threw into the ocean as it hits the floor of the sea, and his costume suddenly bursts out of it, as Spawn is thinking to himself, what is this? I don't understand. And then the costume once again says, my name is Letha, daughter of the 7th House of K. And Spawn says, no, my name is Al Simmons. This is impossible. I buried you. What are you doing back? But the costume responds by stating, we are the daughters of K, and we take sustenance where we have to, but we bond for life. And that Spawn is, in fact, still bonded to the costume despite being separated from it. And the costume then tells him, this is not that you didn't drown me, you drowned yourself. And Spawn continues to dream and have a nightmare of himself sinking deeper and deeper into the sea, stating that there's a horrible pain creeping up inside of his chest when he suddenly awakens to see his hands covered in necroplasm, and the homeless men from before standing around him stating, "Oh, we're really sorry to wake you up and all, but there's a good reason for it, and you might be curious to what exactly that is." One of the men then states, "It was one of these," as he holds up a wooden stake, just like the one that's already been pierced through Spawn's chest, as he realizes that he's now been betrayed by the men that he was bossing around earlier, and that the story is to be continued as we've reached the last page of the story in this issue. We then, of course, see another image info, which at this point are in most of the image books that I've been talking about on this channel. Nothing to see here, just a blurb about what's upcoming in 95. We then reach the spawning ground, and I still find it really odd that this is being included in a mini-series. I guess maybe Todd was just trying to fill out a couple extra pages, or perhaps maybe he just had a backlog of letters that he wanted to answer and was trying to get a few more of those answered in this mini-series. Either way, this one's not super special. However, there were a few things that I thought were interesting. The first letter is from a reader who points out that Spawn is made up of a substance called psychoplasm originally, but then it's changed in a later issue to necroplasm. And he asks Todd for clarification on this. Todd basically just states that he decided to stop calling it psychoplasm and start calling it necroplasm, which in my opinion, he should have been calling it necroplasm from the beginning. I don't know why he wouldn't have. Necroplasm being a substance that would have been more readily understandable to the average reader, as it was something that existed in, fantasy and mythology before Spawn. So for whatever reason, he decided that psychoplasm wasn't working for him, and he changed it to necroplasm, and that's what it is from now on. And honestly, that's what it should have been the whole time. He also states to that same reader that the negative letters that he prints actually don't bother him, because in his opinion, if his character is generating enough of a negative reaction that you are taking the time to write a negative letter back into him, then at least he's still getting a reaction out of you. Basically the pro wrestling philosophy that the worst possible thing is that nobody cares. You either want everyone to love you or you want people to hate you, but you don't want people to be completely apathetic toward you, which, to be fair, is probably the best way you could look at that. You're always going to have your critics, and at least if your critics care enough to criticize you, that means they're still paying attention. Howard Stern actually employed a lot of that line of logic in his early days when people were freaking out about him being the shock jock of the early 90s. Then there's another letter where a woman jokingly writes out that her husband is a huge Spawn fan and that she often finds herself scouring the aisles of Toys R Us trying to find the latest Spawn figures, and if there's anything that she can do that Todd would recommend to basically kind of taper down her husband's Spawn buying habits so that they can have a little more extra money. And Todd actually picks up on the joke and gives a response about how, he could make believe that there's actually way more Spawn merch than he can afford, and instead of buying that, he can save that money and take her out on a romantic dinner every once in a while. And then basically tells the woman who writes in that instead of calling him Todd McFarlane, he can start referring to him, or she can start referring to him as Dear Toddy, kind of a joke on the Dear Abby type of thing, which I appreciated the attempt at humor. And also I found it pretty impressive that this woman was going out of her way to try and buy Spawn figures for her husband. I thought it was really cool that despite the fact that they had been married for a while and had, I think she said 4 children, that she was taking time out of her day to literally hunt down toys at a local Toys R Us. That's dedication. That's a relationship that was going to last, folks. We then reach the end cap section where Todd talks about the new wave of the newly named McFarlane toys that's coming out. Just kind of a little overview about the new stuff that's coming out, and we've seen this before, so I won't get too deep into it. We then get an advertisement for DEF CON 2, which will be which was a Comic-Con that Todd McFarlane was attending back in 1995 in September. Don't know if you were there, but if you were and you had a good time, let me know about it in the comments section below. And we then get an advertisement about Tony Daniel and Kevin Conrad doing an artist signing at the San Diego Comic-Con. And I don't know if I've talked about this yet, but I honestly really like the work that Tony Daniel and Kevin Conrad did on the Blood Feud miniseries. In all honesty, there's very little difference between what they put forth and what we see getting put out by Todd and Greg Capullo at this point. And it really makes Blood Feud just seamlessly blend into the Spawn ethos, which I really appreciate. On the last page of the book, we get an advertisement for Ballistic 2 featuring Wetworks, and this is being published through what was at the time the new Top Cow publishing imprint. Now, for anyone who doesn't know, Top Cow was founded by Mark Silvestri and is kind of the result of a falling out that he had with Rob Liefeld. I'm not going to get too deep into that story because it's kind of a little bit drawn out and I want to have time to address it properly. But Top Cow now operates as a sister company to Image. They're not the same company, but they don't operate solely independent of each other. It's kind of weird, but the fact of the matter is they're still both around today, and I'm happy that they are in fact both around to this day. And on the reverse inside cover, we get an advertisement for Bone, which I gotta be honest, I've never read any of Bone. It wasn't anything that necessarily piqued my interest. Not that I'm necessarily against it either. I have no real opinion about it. It's just something that never really made me gravitate towards the book. You know, it's one of those things where I feel like you either kind of get it or you don't, and I kind of didn't. And that was Spawn Blood Feud number 2. Overall, I like the book okay. I wouldn't say it's like the greatest miniseries in the world, but I enjoy it. I think the artwork looks fantastic. I mean, granted, there's the problem with some non-background panels, which always bothers me a little bit. But overall, I feel like it's pretty solid. And it's kind of a shame that the whole thing has a damper put on it by the fact that it wasn't released when it needed to be released to make sense with the mainline Spawn story. And I feel like that kind of just detracts from this miniseries as a whole, the same way I feel like it does for the Violator Badrock miniseries. It just kind of, I don't understand how you don't have it planned out correctly so that things release at the right time to make sense in the overall continuity of the story. I don't know if it was just poor planning on Todd's part, or maybe some artists weren't getting their work in on time, or maybe there was just some kind of mess at the publishing house. I'm not sure, but either way, it definitely made things a little less enjoyable simply for the fact that you had story points being spoiled by the mainline series because the Blood Feud miniseries didn't come out at the right time, or because Violator was somehow in two places at the same time because of the Violator versus Badrock miniseries not coming out when it should have. But, you know, these are probably things that shouldn't bother me this far into the future from when this stuff was released, because at this point you can just read it in the order that it needs to be read. But then again, these are all just my opinions. Your opinions may be completely different. You may not have a problem with the way this stuff released, and maybe you don't think Blood Feud was all that good of a miniseries to begin with, but if that's the case, it's okay, because everyone's entitled to their own opinions. If you enjoyed today's video, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. And thanks for stopping by. Have a great day.